I have never lost a bet, and I'm going to win this one.
Alexander Voss had never lost a bet in his life. Not because he was lucky, because he cheated, not with loaded dice, but with the one weapon that never failed him, his face, his charm, the effortless, weaponized smile of a man who had been told since birth that the world owed him something. So when his friends dared him to marry the wrong woman, he didn't flinch. He laughed, straightened his tie, and said, "Give me 6 months." He should have asked more questions. It was a Friday night in Manhattan, and the Meridian rooftop was doing what it always did, turning cruelty into entertainment for people with too much money and too little conscience. Waiters moved like shadows. A jazz quartet played something nobody was listening to. This was not a place for music. This was a place for performance. 3 men sat at the corner table, the kind you had to know someone to get. Dominic, already on his 3rd scotch, laughing at something that probably wasn't funny. Rex, the quietest, who always watched before he moved, the most dangerous kind of rich man, and Alexander, who sat at the head because Alexander always sat at the head. His suit was Italian, his posture was rigid, his champagne flute was held loosely, the way you hold something you don't need but enjoy having. "I'm bored," Dominic announced. "You're always bored," Rex said. "Because we always do the same things." Dominic's eyes swept the room slowly, hunting for sport. Then he stopped. There. Across the hall, near the far edge of the gathering, sat a woman, alone. She wore a white dress, clean, simple, the kind that announced nothing and apologized for nothing. No jewelry, no designer logo. She held a black portfolio folder against her side, not a purse, a folder, as if she had come to this glittering party to work. Her eyes were down, moving across something on the table, and there was a stillness about her that made her look almost out of place. Almost. Her face was calm, not cold, calm, the expression of a chess player in the final minutes of a match, already 3 moves ahead of everyone who thought they were watching her. She was heavier than the women in this room were permitted to be by the unspoken rules these people enforced without writing down. She wore no watch, no cocktail rings. She was, by every visible measure, not one of them. Which was exactly what Dominic saw. "That woman," he said, the smile building. "I dare you, Alex. Win her over. Marry her. 6 months. Legal. Registered. The whole thing. Do it, and I sign over the Carrington Island deed. Cash. No lawyers." Rex set his glass down. "You're being disgusting." "I'm being honest," Dominic shrugged. "We've done worse." Alexander looked at her again. She still hadn't looked up. Around her, the party glittered and preened, and she simply worked, unbothered by all of it. He thought about the island. He thought about 6 months, a small price for a permanent prize. How hard could this be? He stood, smoothed his jacket, and crossed the floor. Catherine O'Say did not look up when he arrived. She turned a page, made a notation, then glanced up, not startled, not flattered, just acknowledging, the way you acknowledge a weather change. "Can I help you?" she asked. "I think it's the other way around," he smiled. She looked at him for a quiet moment, then back at her papers. "I doubt that," she said, "but you're welcome to sit." It was not an invitation, it was permission granted by someone who had already decided he was not a threat. Alexander sat. He had no idea he had just made the most expensive mistake of his life. Dear viewers, thank you for being here. If you're watching without subscribing, it's like standing beside Catherine in that room and choosing not to see her. When you click that subscribe button, you stand with every quiet, soft-hearted person who was mocked, underestimated, and still chose to rise. Subscribe now and tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? He called her on a Tuesday. Over 3 weeks, he was patient in the way predators are patient, not from virtue, but strategy. He brought her coffee black, remembered small details, deployed them like tools. He was perfectly calibrated. And Catherine watched him, not with suspicion, not with stars in her eyes, with that same steady calm. She pushed back when he was wrong, quietly, without softening the correction for his ego. She never asked about his net worth or his apartment, the first thing every other woman found a way to bring up within 2 dates. She was, he thought reluctantly, interesting. He ignored it and proposed on a Saturday walk through Riverside Park. Simple, direct, eyes on hers. She was quiet for a moment, long enough that something unfamiliar moved through his chest. Then she said, "All right." Not yes, not of course, just all right, as though she had done her own calculation and arrived at an answer he wasn't privy to. He should have asked what the calculation was. The apartment was enormous and cold in the way expensive things are cold. Clean lines, curated art, the silence of rooms never truly lived in. No photographs, bare counters. The only personal object was a business award on the shelf, facing outward, positioned for visitors. Catherine unpacked in 2 hours, methodical, contained. She didn't rearrange anything or suggest curtains. She simply found available spaces and filled them without disturbing anything else. Alexander watched from the doorway and felt, for one unguarded moment, something close to shame. Then his phone rang. She converted the small office into her workspace, kept the door closed, ate quietly at the kitchen island with her portfolio always open. She never complained about his absence, never performed the role of a woman trying to make a cold man love her. She simply worked. He passed her door past midnight sometimes, saw the light still on, heard fragments of her voice, low, precise, certain. Buy the remaining shares before Thursday. All of them. Yes, I know the price. Buy them anyway. He stood in the hallway, water glass in hand, trying to assemble what he'd heard. She probably works for someone, he thought. An analyst, maybe. He went back to bed. He should have stayed in that hallway a little longer. There is a thing that happens in the financial world that most people never see coming because it is designed that way. It is called a hostile takeover. Imagine a company is a house, Catherine would explain. It belongs to a family with debt. The people they borrowed from are circling, but the family no longer holds enough of the house because someone, quietly, bought the rooms one by one through subsidiary accounts, third-party holdings, channels nobody was watching closely enough, until that someone could simply walk in and say, "I own the majority. I make the decisions now. No permission needed." The law follows the shares. Voss Maritime had been losing money for 14 months. Predatory lenders were already positioned, ready to strip it to parts. 530 employees, crews, dockhands, freight managers would lose everything inside a year. Catherine had seen the financial filings 6 months before she ever walked into that rooftop party. She had not gone there by accident. She typed a message to her attorney. Proceed with the secondary acquisition, quietly. Closed the laptop, turned off the light. In the next room, Alexander slept, dreaming of an island with his name on the deed. It was a Wednesday in November when she heard the cough, going on too long, stopping too abruptly. She found him on the bathroom floor, not crashed, not calling for help, just diminished, sweating, pale, one hand braced against the tub. Without the suit, without the posture, without the performance of his face, he was just a man. "I'm fine," he said immediately. "You're not," she said equally simply. She helped him up without commentary, took his temperature, 103, called her physician contact, made broth from groceries he had never touched, brought water at intervals, laid a blanket over him when he shivered without being asked. He watched all of it with something unguarded on his face, something that might, in another life, have been called gratitude. "Why are you doing this?" he asked, voice rough. "Because you're unwell. You don't have to." She looked at him then, that clear, undeflected gaze, the look of someone who sees you fully, including the parts you hide, and has chosen not to punish you for any of it. "I know I don't have to," she said, and went back to her screen. Alexander lay in the dark thinking about the island, about Dominic's laugh, about the table you had to know someone to get, and how much of his life he had spent at it or reaching for it. He thought about how Catherine had found him on the floor and said nothing about it, not once, just helped. He could not name one person in his actual life who would have done the same. Something in the architecture of Alexander Voss developed its first crack. Comment right now, "I'm still watching. Let's see who stays until Catherine walks into that room." Dominic got impatient. 3 weeks from the 6-month mark, Alexander had gone quiet, not the silence of a man coasting to the finish line, but of a man who had stopped checking the clock. So Dominic sent an anonymous tip to a gossip column everyone claimed not to read and everyone read. The rooftop photograph, the terms, the dare, the woman, the prize. It ran Thursday morning. Catherine read it once, set her phone face down, and sat still for 45 seconds. Then she called her attorney. "Does this change anything on our end?" "Legally, nothing." "Then Thursday's timeline holds." Alexander drove home, found her at the kitchen island, composed as always. She looked up, read his face, and waited. "Sit down," she said. He sat. "I have known about the bet since the 3rd week of our marriage." She folded her hands on the table. "Someone in your circle has a conscience. They told me anonymously. I stayed." "Why?" "Because what I needed required time inside this marriage, and because 530 people needed someone to stay." He didn't understand the second part yet. "I'm sorry," he said, and meant it. The first genuinely unperformed thing he had said to her in 5 months. She nodded once. Not forgiveness, acknowledgement. "I know," she said. Reopened her portfolio. The conversation was over. What Catherine had built was not luck. It was due diligence. 4 months of studying Voss Maritime before she ever agreed to lunch with Alexander. Balance sheets, debt instruments, a clause buried on page 41 of a refinancing agreement that gave an acquiring majority shareholder the right to restructure debt without board approval. "Most people read the headlines," she would say. "I read the footnotes. The story is always in the footnotes." The company wasn't dying from weakness, it was dying from neglect. The bones were good. Excellent, in fact. She had bought the first shares 11 months ago through a holding company registered under a name that meant nothing to anyone who didn't know where to look. One careful purchase each month, just below disclosure thresholds. Patient in the way her results always required. By the morning of the annual gala, Catherine Osei held 54% of Voss Maritime. She had done her homework before anyone thought to check whether she had homework to do. The Caldwell Grand Ballroom communicated importance through architectural weight, marble floors, vaulted ceilings, 800 candles in tiered chandeliers. Alexander arrived with Catherine, spending the drive planning his move, take the microphone during the toast, announce the divorce publicly, win the bet 3 weeks early. He had almost convinced himself he still wanted the island. His father, Edmund, a large man made smaller by 2 years of financial terror, his tuxedo slightly too big for the weight he'd lost worrying, found Alexander at the bar early in the evening. "There's someone I want the room to meet tonight," Edmund said, his eyes moving briefly toward Catherine, who stood talking to the company's chief legal officer. He patted Alexander's arm and walked away. Then Edmund took the microphone and the room settled. He spoke about difficulty, about humility, about someone who looked at something everyone had written off and saw what it could become. Alexander set down his glass. "It is my great honor to introduce the new majority owner and chairperson of Voss Maritime, the person who saved this company, its contracts, and every one of its 530 employees, Catherine Osei." The room didn't applaud immediately. It processed. Catherine walked to the front in the same quiet composure she always wore, but she had dressed tonight for a rival. She set her portfolio on the podium, Not for drama, for record. Inside, signed transfer documents, share certificates, and a restructuring agreement with the predatory lenders already executed at 9 that morning. Alexander stood at the edge of the room. The microphone he had planned to use was 6 feet away and might as well have been on another planet. Dominic said nothing. Rex had already moved toward the exit, and Alexander felt, for the first time, the full weight of what he was. Not the hero of a story about cleverness, but a minor character in a story about character. A man who had stood beside genuine power for 5 months and spent that time planning a joke. The shame was total. It was also, somehow, clean. He did not fight it. He did not threaten lawyers or perform outrage. He went home, sat in the kitchen where she had eaten her quiet dinners, and stayed there a long time. His father removed him from succession the next morning, gently but completely. 2 weeks later, Alexander walked into the company's freight yard, not the executive floor, but the actual operational heart, and asked the floor manager, Curtis, a 19-year veteran, if anything needed doing. Curtis looked at him. "You know inventory software?" "No." "Lift 40 pounds?" "Yes." "Put on the vest." He put on the vest, worked 8-hour shifts, made mistakes and corrected them without ego. The hardest part, being wrong in front of people who once had to defer to him. He ate in the break room, asked questions and listened, flagged a dispatch inefficiency that saved the yard 4 hours a week. In the 5th week, he called Catherine. "I'm not calling about the company," he said first. "I know," she said. He told her the truth, not a prepared speech, because prepared speeches were the old toolkit that had brought them here. He said he had been cruel, even though he'd never used the word on himself. That she had shown him more dignity in 5 months than he had shown anyone in 34 years. That he expected nothing, that he wanted her to know anyway. Silence. "Come to the office Thursday," she said. 9 o'clock. We have work to discuss." The work was real. Catherine had identified a gap in the company's leadership, client relations and contract negotiations, which needed someone who understood the social architecture of the industry's upper tier, someone who knew which rooms to enter and how to speak the language of people who made decisions over dinner. Alexander knew all of that fluently. He had spent his entire life learning it for the wrong reasons. Now it had an honest application. She offered him a defined role, defined salary, defined accountability. No inherited title, no equity, nothing unearned. He accepted without negotiating, which told her more than any apology could. They worked well together the way people do when they stop performing, when the audience is gone and only the actual problem remains. He brought her into rooms she'd have had to fight harder to enter. She gave those rooms something worth entering for. One morning, he brought her coffee, black, no sugar, and set it beside her keyboard without commentary. She looked at it, then at him. "Thank you," she said. "Don't mention it," he said. They went back to work. 8 months later, the company filed its restructured accounts. Every one of the 530 employees kept their jobs. 3 new freight contracts signed in the first quarter. Edmund Voss attended the last signing and sat quietly at the back of the room, watching his son and Catherine across the table from a shipping consortium, and said nothing, and felt everything. There are stories where people get exactly what they deserve. Clean, closed, satisfying like geometry. And then there are the other stories, where the reckoning is not the ending, but the beginning. Where the person who was mocked doesn't just triumph and walk away, but stays. Not from weakness, not from easy forgiveness, but from a decision made with full information and open eyes. Catherine had always worked with full information. What changed was what she chose to do with it. What would you have done in Catherine's place? Saved the company of the man who mocked you, or let it burn? Was this destiny, or a calculated move by a woman already 10 steps ahead of everyone in the room? Either way, the quiet ones are always watching. Pay attention to them.
Subscribe for more timeless stories that will stay with you long after the video ends. The next one begins exactly where you least expect it.